Now, I want to take you back some 50 years. 50 years ago, and most of you barely remember it, 50 years ago was 1956. And in 1956, there occurred a famous war. It's called the Suez War. What had happened was that in an Arab and Muslim country called Egypt, which was the largest Arab country in the world, or in the Arab world, in 1952, the government of Egypt had been overthrown. The ruler of Egypt, you may remember, preferred the Riviera to Egypt, and he ultimately got to live there permanently. His name was Farouk. He was kicked out, and he was replaced by a charismatic and dynamic military leader by the name of Gamal Abdel Nasser. And Gamal Abdel Nasser had an ambition. He said, I am an Arab first, and then I am an Egyptian. My aim is to unite the entire Arab nation from Morocco to Iraq. Do you understand? To bring it together in one people. And I promise you that I will defeat the power whose presence humiliates us, and that is the state of Israel. So there we are. So Gamal Abdel Nasser, as an expression of his new power, now does something that will infuriate the former owners of Egypt. They are the British. They own a canal called the Suez Canal. And in fact, Gamal Abdel Nasser simply takes it. The British are infuriated. The French, who built the canal and have interest in the canal, are furious. They're in particular furious because they're beginning to fight they are fighting the Arabs in Algeria. And in fact, the rising power of Gamal Abdel Nasser is a threat to them. And they want to take care of him. So the British and the French want to take care of Gamal Abdel Nasser, and they'd like some help, and they don't consult the United States, their chief ally. Instead, they make contact with another power that is interested in humiliating and defeating Gamal Abdel Nasser. That is called the State of Israel, which is only 8 years old and has a rather crusty and charismatic leading figure by the name of David Ben-Gurion. And the three powers now conspire. What they will do is Israel will invade Egypt and head for the Suez Canal. And the British and the French, in order to prevent the Israelis from taking the Suez Canal, will assist Gamal Abdel Nasser by sending in paratroopers who will then seize the canal. How do you like that for a plot? Ooh, it's a very good plot. Meanwhile, they get back the what? The canal. They humiliate Gamal Abdel Nasser. They assume that they will ultimately be able to overthrow him. And the Israelis are ecstatic. So that's what happens. In the fall of 1956, 50 years ago, I remember the events vividly. I wasn't present at the events, but I was here when I heard about them. The Israeli army, it's a new little country. I mean, the army had been tested to some degree in the War of Independence, but most people did not know what this army could do. With an invasion heading for the Suez Canal, invading the largest Arab country in the Arab world, well, they cross the border, and the next thing you know is they push the whole Egyptian army out of the way, and they're heading straight for the Suez Canal. And just as they're about to get to the Suez Canal, the paratroopers of Anthony Eden and Guy Mollet come out of the sky. So, Gamal Abdel Nasser now says, it is very clear that the West, the colonial powers that conquered the Arab world, still hate us. maybe what I need to do is to turn to the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, back at the ranch in Washington, there are two people. One, a man struggling to complete a sentence. His name, he is the President of the United States. His name is Dwight D. Eisenhower. He's a great guy, one of the heroes of World War II. And his Cold War Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. And they get together and they agree on what they're going to do. They cannot allow the British and French to take back the Suez Canal, to create the impression in the Arab and Muslim world that the European imperialists are back. And they're infuriated. Who do the British and French think they are? Where would they have been had the Americans not intervened in the Second World War? Who do they think is in charge of the world? Do the British still think they are? So Dwight D. Eisenhower calls Tony, I don't know what they called him, Anthony, whatever it is, and he gave one of his complete sentences. Get out! And he calls Molay and repeats the same complete sentence, which is what? Get out! And you know what? They got out. And Anthony Eden, who was like central casting for British Prime, right? Was there anybody more elegant, more handsome, more elegant, the whole thing, loses his job. His government collapses. He has to leave. And it's very clear who's now in charge of the Western world. It's who? The United States of America. It's not the British Empire. There is no British Empire. And it's not the French. Now, the one group of people who came out of this war with flying colors, even though they couldn't hang on to the Suez Peninsula, were the Israelis. Yes, they were forced to withdraw. He also called Ben-Gurion. The Israelis were forced to pull back. But they had shown the might of their army, right? This little country had what? Invaded Egypt and gone all the way to the Suez Canal. So even if they were forced to withdraw because of American pressure, it was very clear that they had an army that was very credible. In fact, people sort of opened their eyes. Aha! And that was to lead, of course, to the increasing prestige of the Israeli military. The Israeli military now moved forward. Actually, 11 years after the Suez War, another war broke out with Gamal Abdel Nasser. It seemed, it appeared, and most likely was true, that Gamal Abdel Nasser was planning to invade Israel and to destroy it in 1967. He felt he had the power to do that. He had Arab allies. And of course, Israel, knowing that, took preemptive action. In June of 1967, the Israeli Air Force went and destroyed, through bombing, the Egyptian Air Force. I mean, finished it. And ultimately, she would do the same to the allies of the Egyptians, right? She would do it to the Jordanians, and she would do it to the Syrians, and then she sent her armies under Moshe Dayan. And, I mean, it's called the Six-Day War. That's how long the war lasted. It was, for Israel, a supreme moment, I mean. This little country with this incredible army, the United States in 1967 was stuck in Vietnam, trying to chase the Viet Cong and handle North Vietnam, the mightiest nation in the world with the greatest economy, do you understand? And the most powerful military, is losing. And this little pipsqueak, whatever, no, this was a nation with its army, crushes Gamal Abdel Nasser, the forces of Jordan and Syria, seizes not only the Suez Canal, occupies not only the West Bank and Gaza, but also takes from Syria the Golan Heights. What kind of an army is this? Whatever American general was in charge in 1967, nobody could remember his name because all they could see was Moshe Dayan with a patch. It was the supreme moment of Israeli power. In 6 days, Israel tripled the size of its territory, and its troops were on the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was not even operable. Well, that was the supreme moment, and now the consequence of it was very clear. Prior to 1967, and certainly prior to 1958, the chief ally of Israel were the French, based on the principle that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The French were fighting the Arabs in Algeria, and the Israelis were fighting the Arabs in their area, right? They shared an enemy, so the French provided weapons, military support. But when the conflict in Algeria was resolved, when de Gaulle, in quotation marks, betrayed the people who put him into power, because he came to power saying what? He was going to keep Algeria. When he made peace with the Algerians and his whole agenda changed, the French withdrew and the Israelis were left what? High and dry. But in 1967, there was sealed a new alliance. The United States of America was overwhelmingly impressed. Gamal Abdel Nasser had arranged to go over to the Soviet Union, and the United States of America was looking for reliable allies in the Middle East. There were the Saudis. They had the oil, but their army was not prepared, given the ambivalence of their nation, of their people, about the American alliance to be very effective for America. So Israel, there was this army, this incredible army. And that was also backed up by the fact that there were so many Jews living in the United States of America. I mean, you put the two together, and all of a sudden this alliance emerged. An alliance which meant that Israel could always count on the support and intervention of the United States of America. It was very important. It was a great moment, and it was built on the perception on the part of the United States of America that Israel had one of the most extraordinary military machines in the world. This little nation was militarily a big power, certainly if you're talking about the Middle East. She had kept the enemy at bay. She had humiliated them. And then the problems began. 1967 was the peak for the Israeli military. 6 years later, there was a problem. On Yom Kippur Day, Nasser had died and he was replaced by a man called Anwar Sadat. And on Yom Kippur Day, the Egyptian army crossed the Suez Canal and assaulted the Israeli army, and the Israeli army was unprepared. The ruler of Israel at that time was Golda Meir, and for all these plays and musicals and who knows what about Golda, she lost her job. I mean, she was the management. And they failed. The Egyptians what? Crossed the Suez Canal. Now, two things rescued the glory and image of the Israeli army. One was that Arik Sharon, who was one of the generals in the army at that time, created this brilliant diversion whereby he took the Israelis across the Suez Canal, do you remember this? And headed for Cairo, almost cutting off the Egyptian forces in Suez. Ultimately, a truce was made, and the second thing was very simple. The president of Egypt, who had crossed the canal, Anwar Sadat, 4 years later, flew on his own from Cairo to Tel Aviv or Jerusalem to sue for peace. Now, the most dangerous frontier for Israel was the frontier of Egypt. There, at that time there were 60 million people on the other side of the border, and the Israelis had 3.5 million people. And peace was made. So, in some ways, the Israeli military was sufficiently intimidating that Anwar Sadat was willing to risk what? The whole anger of the Arab world and the Muslim world in order to do this. He was an outcast. So in some way, the Israeli army survived the humiliation of the Yom Kippur War. And then a civil war broke out in Lebanon. It started in 1975. By 1982, the Palestine Liberation Organization, led by Yasser Arafat, was proving to be enormously successful in that war, and Israel could not allow that to continue. So in 1982, the government had changed. The Labor Party was no longer in power. A new political party called the Likud was in power, led by Menachem Begin, and the defense minister at that time was Arik Sharon. And Sharon said, "We are going to invade Lebanon, and we're going to defeat Arafat." So the Israeli army invades Lebanon, boom, 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 all the way to Beirut. They ultimately take Beirut, and they will force Arafat to fly from Beirut. The PLO in Lebanon is destroyed. Now something will happen. I mentioned it last week. The Christian allies of the Israelis in Lebanon have a militia. It's called the Phalange. And the Phalange is allowed to enter two Palestinian refugee camps, Sabra and Shatila, where they conduct a massacre. That scandal outrages world public opinion, and Israel is forced to withdraw. But I do want to tell you that in the Lebanon war, the Israeli military did not lose its image of power. The massacre wasn't the Israeli military, right? They were successful. They quickly, a very short period of time, they drove Arafat from Lebanon. It was the Phalange, allowed by Sharon to do their thing, that was responsible for the retreat. Oh. Now, very important for Israel in its alliance with America is that the United States of America perceive its army as extraordinary. It's one of the reasons for the what? The alliance. No extraordinary army, no extraordinary military then the reason for the alliance shrinks in importance. Huh? Got it? Sometimes in relations, you have to impress people either that you are very strong, very powerful, or very smart, or the what? The connection will go. Now, the Lebanon War did not impress the Americans as an Israeli military failure. It was a political failure. And in fact, the reputation of the Israeli military only grew. There was all this rumor now going on about the weapons. One of the things that the Israeli military, together with the Israeli government, arranged for, which was very important and known to everybody, was very public, is that Israel turned to the manufacture of weapons. The famous Israeli gun, the Uzi rifle. Oh. Now they're into the manufacture of weapons, and in fact, the weaponry of the State of Israel is manufactured in cooperation with the United States of America and is now sold to appropriate people all over the world. So not only is Israel a military power in terms of its army, also in terms of its weaponry. And the rumor now circulates that the State of Israel has an atom bomb. Not one, maybe two, maybe three, maybe four, maybe five. Now the United States of America gets very concerned when its enemies have atom bombs. But they weren't concerned about Israel having one because Israel was what? An ally and a friend. So you got this image. This image is only what getting, I mean, this is an intimidating image. The little country. Don't mess with us. Well, what happened, of course, was after the collapse of the PLO in Lebanon, the Palestinians tried a new strategy. And that strategy, of course, was a winning strategy to some degree. What's the new strategy? If you're going to meet the Israeli army on the battlefield, you're going to lose. But if you conduct guerrilla warfare, you may not lose. Look what happened in Vietnam to America. Did we not have the greatest military machine right in the world? Could we bomb any place to smithereens? Yes. Did it make any difference in Vietnam? No. We didn't know what to do. We weren't even trained to deal with a war. So now the new strategy emerges. It started in 1987. It's called the Intifada. So now little kids with stones come out on the street and they throw them at Israeli soldiers. So inevitably what will happen is that some Israeli soldiers will shoot and these children will be killed. Now all of this is, we're in the new age, all of this is being filmed. As I've said on many occasions, if previous wars had been filmed and put on public television, so the Romans are watching the Carthaginian, I don't know, whatever. But the history of humanity would have been what? Different. There is now in this global village, because of this filming, something called world public opinion that instantaneously can participate in all the events taking place in the world almost at the time they are occurring. Oh, sir, would you mind destroying that bomb again? I didn't get the right... I didn't get the right angle, huh? But that's what we're doing. We all sit there, eating our Cheerios, or whatever we're doing. So now you're sitting and you're watching children being assaulted by the Israeli army. And the Israelis say, well, what do you expect us to do? Because the children are also accompanied by terrorists who blow up things. Well, how do you handle terrorists? You send 3 regiments? I mean, what do you do? Well, what finally the Israelis did, which was of course filmed, was you find out who the family is, and then you go to their house and you blow it up. So there is this weeping mother who hasn't done anything. Do you understand? So she's standing outside. She and her husband built this house from scratch, whatever else it is. So their son did go and commit a terrorist act. So now you can't even get the son, right? So now you blow up their house. It's an act of desperation, isn't it? So you're eating your Cheerios. Whom do you sympathize with? I mean, the new tactic sort of went around all the skills the Israeli army had, right? It's a new way of fighting the war. Not on battlefields. Give them the battlefield in Suez. How do you deal with this? The Intifada was to be a major problem. Ultimately, something similar would happen in Lebanon. At the end of the Lebanese war, the entire Israeli army did not withdraw. They remained in South Lebanon. In fact, they created a collaborator army called the SLA, the South Lebanese Army, which I referred to last week. But the area was infiltrated now by a radical group of Shiites called the Hezbollah. And in fact, they didn't meet the Israelis on the battlefield. And if you're bombing them, you're bombing a whole village and killing what? All these innocent people, because that's how they operate. In and out of a house, in the basement. Oh, it's clandestine. Hide the rocket behind the bushel. Yeah. What kind of a war? This isn't a war that Moshe Dayan fought. And in fact, they killed many Israeli soldiers on a continuous basis, just as American soldiers were killed in Vietnam, despite American power, and America could not stop it. So, in the year 2000, the Prime Minister of Israel was a member of the Labor Party. His name was Ehud Barak, and he had a plan for making permanent peace. So he withdraws the army, the Israeli army, from Lebanon. Now, is that perceived as strength or weakness? Ehud Barak says, don't worry, everybody will see it as strength. We are so secure that we have retreated. Yes, Ehud, that's right, I guess that's, it's a victory. Meanwhile, Hezbollah moves in and occupies the territory which was evacuated. So that now brings me to 2006. As you notice, I don't say 2006, because I never said 1,906, and I never said 1,806. I said 1906, so I always say 2006. Okay, so anyway, It's 2006. And Hezbollah kills and kidnaps Israeli soldiers. It's an act of provocation. And the Israeli army now respond. When I say the army, I mean the army, the navy, the air force. The ports of Lebanon are blocked, you understand? The air force now goes on a bombing rampage. Bomb, 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 bomb. But in the interim, or while this was going on, Hezbollah is sending the rockets over the border, and Ehud Olmert, who is the prime minister of Israel, says to America, his ally, look, just give us a few more days and we'll what? We'll finish them off. But the rockets keep coming. And ultimately, America itself has come to realize the Israelis can't do it. Now, this is a very important moment. What's very important to Israel's security is that the United States of America perceives the Israeli military as what? Infallible. If you simply send them in, even if they're provocative, they will do it just like, ooh, ooh, ooh. In fact, they tell the Israelis, we're bringing in the UN, your favorite organization. Now all hell breaks out, not in terms of physical fighting, but in terms of political fighting. Because Israel is now confronted with a humiliating defeat. Now, there are certain ways you can handle defeat. You can say, we won. We did that with Vietnam, I think. I don't know. Korea, we did that. We did okay. We won. It's true, we withdrew all the way from the Yalu and said, we won. Thank you. We won. The second thing you can do is to say, well, it wasn't a splendid victory, but we won. And of course, there were people that did that. They said, look at all the devastation they have to deal with. They'll rethink it. And of course, as I mentioned last week, Hassan Nasrallah, who is the head of the Hezbollah, made a statement with tears streaming down his cheeks. If only I had known what would happen by this killing and kidnapping, I certainly would never have allowed it. So now somebody picks up and says, you see? We won. What is that? What do you mean? What everybody in Israel knows and senses, otherwise there wouldn't be any trouble. If Israelis felt they had won, there wouldn't be any what? Political trouble, right? The universal sentiment in Israel is that it was an Israeli defeat, and in particular, it tarnished the image of the Israeli army. And now they want to know who's to blame. But I listen in restaurants. I always eavesdrop. When people ask me why I'm doing it, I say, because you're talking too loud. Anyway. So. It's like people on cell phones. They expect you not to hear them. They're screaming into the cell phone. What am I supposed to do? I sometimes want to intrude and correct their grammar, but it's okay. So you listen in on this conversation, and basically what it is that the defeat is very serious, because if I listen into conversations, half the conversations I listen to are conversations about whose fault it is, who's to blame. Not my fault, it's your fault. And that's where Israel is now. Who's to blame? Soldiers have come out into the what? Into the streets. There are demonstrations in front of the Knesset building. There are demonstrations in front of Ehud Olmert's home. They're out there. Men who say there weren't enough supplies, and above all, the strategy was all wrong. We shouldn't have bombed. We should have sent the army in, and we should have cleaned out those nests of guerrillas, even though the casualties might have been high. Some people say, out with Olmert. He just got the job. Now, in order to understand what's going on in Israel, now I have to give you some background. And I have to tell you about what I call the foundation of Israeli power. So that's very important, because it's the first foundation of Israeli power was something called the Zionist movement. It was a movement organized in response to rising anti-Semitism in Europe back in 1897. It was led by a charismatic figure, Theodor Herzl. And the Zionist movement swept through the Jewish world and mobilized millions of Jews. It ultimately became the most exciting thing in the Jewish world in the 20th century. No religious movement, do you understand? Swept through the Jewish world the way the Zionist movement swept through the Jewish world. And in fact, one of the foundations of Israeli power was that from almost the beginning, she was able to mobilize world Jewish public opinion, do you understand, in support and in favor of it. The second foundation of Israeli power was the Yishuv. The word Yishuv means settlement. It was the settlement of 600,000 Jews in Israel prior to the independence of Israel in 1948. They came between basically 1902 and 1948, 600,000 of them. They overwhelmingly came from Europe. They were Europeans, many of them with BAs and MAs. They were well-educated European people. And they came into a world which was somewhere in the Middle Ages. So, the value in terms of power of each of the members of the Yishuv compared to the education and training of the people around them was what, 5 to 1, 6 to 1, whatever it was. I mean, the arrival of the Ashkenazic Jews was equivalent to the arrival of the British or the French or whatever. The sophisticated people of Europe who now entered into the Middle East. They knew science and management. And the wonderful thing about this Yishuv was, and that's why I didn't sign up for it, is that all these people of good education, many of them intellectuals, decided, for the sake of establishing control over the area, to become farmers. Milking cows, remember all that? Milking cows, shoveling. That did it for me. When I walked into that dairy farm, it was over. Finished. I was attracted by the ideology, but that was it. Over. Couldn't handle it. So we have this little kibbutz settlement. It's a farmer settlement. Is it like the peasants in central Romania? No! It's a group of people sitting around discussing Marx. Or the latest in operas. It was an incredible settlement. Do you understand? It was a European settlement. Everybody says, oh, these poor refugees. In a sense, they were refugees from anti-Semitism. But they were well-educated Europeans. It's one of the foundations of the success, because I want to tell you, if 600,000 Jews from Morocco or Algeria or Tunisia had been the issue, it would have been a different story. The third foundation of Israeli power was the emergence, almost from the very beginning, of something these intellectuals said they didn't want. The Jews had been a disarmed people for 2,000 years. They didn't have any military training. And they now idealistically didn't want any military training, except they arrived in a neighborhood where the people living there didn't want them and began to attack them. So now they what? They have to respond. So now you have to turn intellectuals in many cases into soldiers. It's one of the great achievements of Israel. In fact, the best soldiers came from the agricultural settlements that were created. Farmer children always make better soldiers than urbanites. You can't get good soldiers out of central Manhattan. Never. Can't. But you can from farms in Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi. So, ironically, by turning to this farming, they produced what I would call the officer corps of the Israeli army. They all came either from the kibbutzim or the moshavim, the agricultural settlements, including Moshe Dayan. So the children of the intellectuals became soldiers. And in fact, they were fantastic soldiers. So, now there emerges the Haganah, the defense force, against the Arab opposition, and that will turn into the Israeli army, the foundation of the Israeli army. And the next thing you know, every Israeli male and ultimately every Israeli female will be drafted into this military force. An incredible achievement. The fourth was the economy. Israel is now a first world economy. You cannot be a significant military power if you don't have the what? The money or the resources in some way to support it. So they started off with oranges. And then they moved on to textiles. And then when the Chinese killed the textile industry, they turned to two things which are still there in Israel as the foundation of the economy. One is weapons, the manufacture of weapons, and two, high tech. Israel, in many cases, is the high-tech center, if you will, of the Middle East. It's the Silicon Valley. And that's because they had the brain power. The brain power was not only the Ashkenazic brain power that came from the original Yishuv, but over the last 20 years, 1 million Russian Jews, some of them very well educated, came to live in Israel. So you got an economy, right? Without that economy, which has, by the way, now produced first world wonders, we have people living in gorgeous neighborhoods, living in lovely apartments. You have poverty, you have the dichotomy, all of that, but you have what we call an economy that is very much like an American economy. That isn't true of Egypt or Syria. It's a little European, American-style economy stuck in the Middle East. The fifth foundation of Israeli power is its political stability for a long time. The Ashkenazic Jews from Eastern Europe. The word Ashkenazic means Jews from Northern Europe. So the Jews from northeastern Europe that came to found what I call the Yishuv, to be that Yishuv, came to a large degree as socialists. And in fact, the first farm settlements they established had what we call socialist overtones. But socialism died in Israel for two reasons, or three. One, it doesn't work. No. The second reason was that the Soviet Union, the capital, do you understand, of world communism, turned against the state of Israel and embraced the Arab cause shortly after the establishment of the state of Israel. So, and the third is that the major ally of the state of Israel is the United States of America, which is the capital of the capitalist world and contains the largest Jewish community in the world, which is full-time into capitalism. So in the end, the Labor Party talked about socialism in the same way that the Chinese Communist Party talks about socialism, but they don't do any of it. They became the leaders of capitalism in Israel, and the people who live in the best areas in Israel are the children and grandchildren of these socialists. If you go to Herzliya, which is the Bloomfield Hills of Tel Aviv, and you go from house to house, you will find these people. They all had grandparents who were socialists. So, they created a political party called the Labor Party. It should be called the former Labor Party. You can't get rid of a name. Do I like Sherwin? I can think of 5 or 6 alternatives that I would have preferred. It's too late. It's over. Finished. I did start with Sherwin, but then I got to Sherwin. So it's the Labor Party, and in fact, until 1977, it was the political party in charge. It created what we call political stability. And in fact, the Labor Party provided all the people, because many of them came from the kibbutzim, provided the officer corps of the Israeli army. Moshe Dayan, all these people. Ben-Gurion was what? The Labor Party. Israel is one of those countries where the rich support the Socialist Party. I mean, it's absolutely, do you understand? It's absolutely ironic. But it did provide political stability. So you had this alliance between the military, do you understand, and the Labor Party, and together it was political stability, and therefore there was a sense of solidarity and unity. not only from the external enemy or imposed by the external enemy, but also arising out of the center of the nation. And the last was that in the 1960s, the United States of America, the most powerful nation in the world, became the ally and protector of the state of Israel. You got this? I mean, it's pretty formidable. When you look at the size of Israel on the map, you say, oh, please, it's so small, whatever. Well, it's a little bit like looking at Singapore. No. All right? Sometimes size is not the only, it's not the only criteria. Now, along the way, and that's part of the story which leads, of course, to the present, are the challenges that this system of power confronted. And the first challenge, and it relates to what's happening, is the change in population. I want to tell you, and we know this from Detroit, there are no stable neighborhoods. Do you know that? We think finally the neighborhood is what? That's it. People are what? Moving. All right. From the beginning, one of the major problems of Israel, which affected its future and power, was it had an insufficient number of Jews. So they sent missionaries out to America to persuade people like me to come. I told you I thought about it until I had these visions of the dairy farm. So, I mean, they came. What they got from American Jews was what? Money, enthusiasm. Give me another Hava, Nagila, Hava, Nagila, Hava, Nagila. All right. What they didn't get was anybody who what? A few who picked themselves up and went. The other large community was stuck in communist Russia. The only Jews left were Jews who were not culturally like the Jews who had established the state of Israel. They're called Mizrahim, Eastern Jews. They come from Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Yemen, and so forth. Their culture is a culture that was influenced deeply by the Muslim world, right? But they're the only ones around, so in 1949, since the victory of Israel has threatened their security where they're living, they pick themselves up because they want to get out. And they run to Israel, creating what I would call a culture conflict, which has not yet been fully resolved. Certainly prior to the coming of the Russian Jews, the majority of the Jews in Israel were no longer Ashkenazic Jews from Europe. They were what? Jews from the Eastern world who resented the Ashkenazic Jews, who often viewed them with contempt or patronizing niceness. All right, they didn't like that. And so they burned with resentment. And that resentment ultimately was to have political consequences. When the Russian Jews came, it was generally assumed that since they were Ashkenazic, they would support the Labor Party. Wrong. You mention the word socialism to a Russian Jew, having lived in communist Russia. Do you understand? I mean, they want to kill you. The last party they would join is, they didn't realize it was the capitalist party. Plus, this was now the establishment and they were refugees. So they also burned with resentment. There was a second problem. It was called religion. The state of Israel was established by secular Jews. Religious Jews did not come, or very religious Jews did not come, because their rabbis said they shouldn't. They shouldn't come because Jews should only go back to the homeland when God sends his Messiah. And when God wants us to return, he will what? Return us. And to do it on your own is blasphemy. Okay, fine. Thank you. So there was a small Orthodox group that was called Mizrahi that functioned, but it was small. The people were overwhelmingly secular. You would never, before 1977, find any member of the Israeli government walking around with a yarmulke, except maybe the minister of religion who was a member of the Mizrahi party. No, nobody. You would find Israelis traveled freely on Saturday, do you understand, on Shabbat. I mean, that was the culture of Israel. It was very what? It was very, very secular. And then it changed in 1967 when the West Bank was taken, and the West Bank contains all the sacred biblical, most of the sacred biblical sites. The West Bank is the homeland of the Jewish people. Where the Jews are now living in Israel, the Philistines lived. That's Tel Aviv. The homeland is the West Bank. So, since that territory with all the holy sites were taken, the Orthodox now said, God has used atheists to bring, do you understand, this country to salvation, and now they poured out of Brooklyn and wherever they were, they went straight for Israel. And their numbers what? Increased. And they have a tendency to do something that more affluent secular people do not do. They have babies. Babies, 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 the whole thing. So their population now is what? Growing, 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 and they arrive in secular Israel. People are driving around on Saturday on the Sabbath in their cars. Women are draped, I should say undraped, with their bikinis on Rosh Hashanah on a Tel Aviv beach. What is this culture? Is this Jewish culture? No. We have to bring, do you understand, the Jewish state to Jewish culture, the religion. Oh. So now an internal battle starts, which is, it's called the Kulturkampf, the culture war, the religion war between the Orthodox and the secularists. It's still what? It's still going on. It's a major problem. It is destabilizing. Because if there's one thing these people do not wish to give up, it is the West Bank. The West Bank contains all the holy sites. Abraham did not sun himself on the Tel Aviv beach. He wandered through the West Bank. So they're not going to give it up. Do you understand? Even if you kill them. So that creates, to say it's an understatement, a little political instability. Then you have lifestyle. So now when I first remember Zionism in the 1930s, they always had the picture. Brave farmer, what does he need? A hut. Works all day, do you understand? His great entertainment is to show up at the dining room of the kibbutz and they all sit around and talk about how they're going to improve the kibbutz. Do they need money? No. Do they need shopping? No. They live ascetic lives. They're noble people. What? Thank you. Then capitalism arrived. It's called the consumer culture. I do want to tell you that the first soldiers of Israel came out of this ascetic culture. The soldiers are now recruiting for the Israeli army. What? Some of them live in Herzliya, Bloomfield Hills. So they're trying to figure out their sixth major in college. They're partly in the leisure culture. The kinds of discipline that were part of what I call a farm community are simply what? They're not there. We know about this because we've had this experience in the United States of America. So the lifestyle of Israel has changed. In fact, one of the most interesting changes in Israel is in South Tel Aviv, there may be 300,000 people who are not Jews or Arabs. They're Romanians, Koreans, Filipinos, and whatever else. They've been imported into Israel because now affluent Israelis don't wish to do their own cleaning, dusting, or babysitting. It's annoying. I've noticed that also in Birmingham. It's inevitable do you understand? So now, the pool from which you are drawing the Israeli military, even Germany has experienced this. You're drawing it from people in some cases, an affluent culture. Their lifestyle is entirely different from the lifestyle of the people who initially organized against overwhelming odds in marshes, deserts, whatever, the original army. And then one of the major challenges are the Arabs. At first, the Arabs in Palestine or Israel called themselves Arabs, which had a propaganda advantage for Israel. Because if the Arab world stretches from Morocco to Iran, then there's got to be room for the what? The refuge. What are you talking about? All we want is this little itsy bitsy piece of land, and you get all this land. But then, after the 1967 war, the Arabs in Palestine, led by Arafat, changed the strategy. They started calling themselves Palestinians. Oh. Palestinian Arabs. Well, now, Palestine, that's Israel, is their what? Is their homeland. Settling down in Syria is what? Not an alternative. Settling down in Egypt is not an alternative. Yes, they're Arab, but they're not Palestine. Oh. So now we have the PLO, and now there is this feeling. Palestinians are Arabs, but they're more than Arabs. They are what? Palestinians, and Palestinian self-awareness was created by this war. And now it's so strong that the feeling is there. We need to return to what? To where we were. The other change is very important. The first leaders, if you will, of the Arab resistance to the Zionists were secular. And they failed. The most important secularist was Gamal Abdel Nasser, and he was defeated in 1967. The second was Yasser Arafat, and he was defeated in 1982. So now another group appeared. They're called Muslim fundamentalists. They're not secular, they're very religious, and they're saying that the only way for the Palestinians and the Arab world to recover this land is to return to the old religion. And they have been very successful in mobilizing millions and millions of people. So in the Palestinian world, in addition to the PLO, you also have Hamas, right? Hamas hated Arafat. Hamas was the creation of the Sunni fundamentalist world. And in Lebanon, you have Hezbollah, right? The first party that was organized among the Shiites was called Amal. That was a secular party. That's lost out to Hezbollah. So now you've got this new force, and this new force is able to produce a new kind of soldier that I referred to last week a Muslim fundamentalist revolutionary who's called a martyr. Now they have become the toughest soldiers for the Israelis to fight. They're willing to what? Yeah, blow themselves up. So the Arab world, by the way, do you understand? The Arab enemy for Israel has also altered. Now the next challenge was the Labor Party falls in 1977. It mainly falls because Golda Meir didn't handle the Yom Kippur War appropriately. And Yitzhak Rabin's wife had some kind of an account in New York that she wasn't supposed to have. It doesn't make any difference. The Labor Party had lost its credibility and it fell, and it was replaced by a new party. It's a coalition of parties, but it's really a new party. It's called Likud. If the Labor Party is the liberal party, the Likud party is the conservative party. Now the story in Israel is rich people vote liberal, poor people vote conservative. Don't laugh, because in this country that's what happened to some degree in the presidential election when all these poor people voted for the, fundamentalists voted for the Republicans. So, the poor people, the people who hate the Labor Party, Eastern Jews, they don't like the Ashkenazic Jewish establishment, and they voted against it. And who supported Likud? The Orthodox, who don't like the Labor Party because they're what? Secular. So put them together, and now you've got a brand new coalition. Now let me just tell you the problem with this coalition. The socialists in the Labor Party would totally resent my saying this, but I'm going to say it. The Yishuv, the first settlement of Jews that came to Israel, created an aristocracy. They did. It was a group of people, do you understand, filled with idealism, highly motivated, in most cases well-educated, who consented to perform the most menial tasks, do you understand, and to endure the greatest risks in order to make that vision work. And they became the establishment. And they were a kind of self-aware elite. Likud doesn't have it. It's like a mixture of, do you understand, wannabes. And they don't have what I call that central core. And in fact, that central core may never again appear because it came out of the founding fathers. Do you understand? It was the foundation of the state. So the Likud is more amorphous, but their agenda was very clear. It followed the Six-Day War. We are in danger, and they were right. And because we are in danger, we have to guarantee our security. And because we have to guarantee our security, we will not surrender 1 inch of land. Now, one of the leading spokespersons of that position was a man called Arik Sharon. And one of the more famous leaders of the Likud, the first one was Menachem Begin, then came Yitzhak Shamir, and then came somebody who's still around. His name is Bibi Netanyahu. Now, the sixth challenge was totally unexpected. Because what was unexpected was the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, the fall of the Soviet Union was dangerous for Israel. Because one of the reasons for the alliance with the United States of America was what? The alliance against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union falls, and when it falls, the American government, at that time George Bush Sr. is the President of the United States, and Baker will become the Secretary of State, now agree that what America needs to do is to make allies in the Muslim world because its oil resources are there, right? And in fact, what is most provocative in the Arab world is the issue of Israel and Palestine and whatever else it was. So, pressure is brought to bear, and out of it will emerge a peace proposal. And the next thing you know, Likud falls because it resists that. And a man called Yitzhak Rabin, who was the prime minister, comes back. And he now becomes the leader of the peace movement. And the Americans say to the Israelis, go talk. And Clinton brings them together on the White House lawn, and they shake hands. And then the King of Jordan shows up the next year, and they shake hands. Now, there's a lot of hope generated by that peace movement. Likud has fallen, labor is back in power, but I do want to tell you, the peace movement came to nothing. What emerged from the peace movement was something called the Palestinian Authority, some semblance of a recognized Palestinian government, that was it. And the turning over of some areas of the West Bank to the Palestinians. Why did it fail? Well, it's not difficult. The Jews in Israel are deeply ambivalent about the peace. Of course they want peace, but they're deeply ambivalent about whether you can trust the Arab world. And so they want certain guarantees that the Arab world is not able to or willing to provide. That's it. You have this in conversations. Sometimes I hear people, somebody will say, do you love me? Yes. Not enough. I mean, do you really? Do you ever have those conversations? I mean, it's like, you know, you can't, because the anxiety level, there's an anxiety level on the part of the person who's asking the question, and it's justified. What reason do I have to trust you? How do I know that if I sign a peace treaty with you, you won't be overthrown in what? 2 weeks and I'll be facing what? A fanatic, a crazy person. And the other reason why it failed was that the Arab world and the Muslim world are ambivalent. Why are they ambivalent? Well, it's very simple. They look, and this is very relevant to what Sherwin would do. They look at Israel in occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and they look at all the Arabs inside of the old Israel, and they look at the Jewish birth rate, and they look at the what? The Arab birth rate, and they say, we've waited 80 years, so we'll wait another what? 30. What's going to happen is that we will have more babies than the Jews. And ultimately, we will prevail. They will be the minority and we will be the majority. So why should we make peace? Why don't we just make their lives miserable? And just what? Wait. In fact, if we make their lives miserable, many of them will simply pick themselves up and what? And leave. Got the, it's a strategy. And by the way, that is the feeling of Hamas. The Muslim fundamentalists, that is their what? That is their strategy. It is ridiculous. We want the whole thing back. It belongs to us. If we're patient, will get it. So you have Jewish ambivalence and you have what? You have Arab ambivalence. So in the end, you get two ambivalents talking to each other. You don't get an agreement. The peace agreement failed. And when the peace agreement failed, somebody came to power. Likud came back to power, and the leader of Likud was this man who said, never 1 inch. His name was Arik Sharon. And what preceded immediately before this war was the political revolution. The whole political map of Israel was redrawn by Arik Sharon. What did he do? Well, very bold. He said, I no longer believe that the security of the state of Israel means hanging on to all the land we have. Is that you, Arik? Get a psychiatrist. Something, he's having a nervous breakdown. What, did you say that, Arik? Because he hears what the radical Muslims are saying, and they're partly right. He says that the only way we can survive as a Jewish state is we have to shrink our territory so that we can guarantee a Jewish majority. Got it? And that means we'll have to give up Gaza, and that's good riddance of bad rubbish. And we'll have to give up maybe most of the West Bank, but there's no alternative. Because if we don't do it, in fact, the Muslim fundamentalists are right. There will be an Arab majority in Israel. So his chief deputy was the former mayor of Jerusalem, a figure not too charismatic. He took 3 charisma courses at the Hebrew University and flunked all 3. All right. His name is Ehud Olmert, all right? And actually he basked in the light and the sun of this charismatic figure, Arik Sharon, and people trusted Sharon because he was a soldier. I mean, he had proven that he cares, risked his own life. So now comes Sharon's plan. Sharon's plan was conceived only a few months before this war started. What was the plan? Since you can't negotiate with these people because you can't negotiate, Israel will act unilaterally. They have a very good precedent because the United States of America has been acting unilaterally. So it's a very good precedent. Israel will act unilaterally, and it will draw its own boundaries for its own safety, excluding large Arab populations that it doesn't want within its boundaries. Got it? That's it. Having done that, what we will do is withdraw from the territory outside the boundaries we have drawn. So we will withdraw from Gaza and we will withdraw from most of the West Bank. There are 250,000 Jews in the West Bank in Jewish settlements. We will draw the boundaries in such a way that 170,000 will still stay in the what? In the state of Israel, and the remaining 80,000 will have to move. And if they refuse, I'm Arik Sharon. This is for the survival of the Jewish state. The third thing we will do is we will draw a wall along the line that we have chosen. We will build a wall. And we will become, and I've used this phrase before, a gated community. the Pebble Creek of the Middle East. You have to drive your car up to the entrance, do you understand? Identify yourself, otherwise you're not going to get in, and most likely Palestinian Arabs will have a hard time getting in. As I've said to you many times, there are a dozen gated communities in this area that I refuse to go to because the hassle at the gate is it's too much. I can't handle it. Can't handle dairy farms and gated communities. Okay, fine. So now Israel will become a gated community with a wall. And our security will also be guaranteed by our chief ally, the United States of America, which will be very pleased that we have withdrawn from these territories and provided a basis, do you understand, for approval on the part of both the Muslim and the European worlds. And most important of all, if these people do not behave and try to invade our gated community, we will sally forth through the gates and we'll give it to them. Our concept, what are we? Are we a nation inside the Muslim world? Well, not really. We are a people of European culture. We are a European nation. We wish to have relationships with people who have European culture. They are in Europe, North America, Latin America, and now China, Japan, all those people. They're all part of the global economy. We're going to relate to them. And these other people will know. They better not penetrate the wall. And, by the way, he made one little error. One of the things you can do to annoy the people in Pebble Creek, despite the wall, is you could send rockets over the wall. Right? I mean, forget the gate. Maybe I will go to these places on a missile. That's the way to get it. So the last thing he said was, since the Likud party, of which I am the leader, is giving me a headache resisting me, I'm going to create a new party, a center party, for all those people who believe in my vision, and they can come from anywhere. He called the party Forward. It's better than backward. Forward. The way you say forward in Hebrew is Kadima. So he creates the Kadima party and presents the program, and polls indicate that he will be successful. He has redrawn the whole political boundary. The Labor Party will be finished. The Likud party will be finished. We have this new vision, and that's how we're going to survive. In January, he has a stroke. Now there is a question about whether the plan will go through, but he's been very good at mobilizing people. His deputy, Ehud Olmert, will what? Succeed him and keep Sharon alive, because it's very important that people not perceive him as what? As dead. All right, so they're keeping him they're keeping him alive. Olmert is now the prime minister, and Olmert says, I'm going to do it. You think I don't have any charisma? I do. All right, okay, Ehud. So the next thing you know is Gaza is what? I mean, it's been evacuated, and now, simultaneous, by the way, to all of this, an election is held, and Kadima wins. There are 120 seats in the Knesset, and 29 go to Kadima. It's pretty good given Israeli elections. And then you need more than 60 to have a government, right? Over half. So he gets the Labor Party to join him, making the leader of the Labor Party, Amir Peretz, the defense minister. Defense minister. That's fine. So you got two men in charge now, do you understand, of the military who know virtually nothing about the military, but it's all right. And then he picks up an ultra-Orthodox party of Eastern Jews called Shas that will sell their soul to anybody for money for their schools or themselves. So he picks up 12. So there are 19, so there's 29 Kadima, 19 Labor, which now gives you 48. And then you can throw in 12 Shas, that gives you what? 60. And he picks up another party, which could be organized in America. These are Israelis who are worried they're not going to get their pension because the economy is suffering a crisis. 7 votes. 67, he's got a good majority. He's now there. He gives jobs to all the members of the parties. He's now going forward. The political map of Israel has been altered. Bibi Netanyahu is left in charge of a little itsy-bitsy Likud going absolutely nowhere. And now he is making plans to evacuate most of the West Bank, preserving 170,000 Orthodox Jews and others in the settlements. You understand? It's going to be great success. And world public opinion is now, European public opinion in particular, has changed. They're willing to withdraw. And in fact, the opinion gets even better because simultaneous to his organizing the new government, an election is held among the Palestinians for their legislature, and the PLO of Arafat, who is now dead, is repudiated, and they now put in power a bunch of Muslim fundamentalists called Hamas who say, we refuse to recognize the right of the state of Israel to exist. So Olmert now turns to the world and says, you complain about the fact we're doing this unilaterally. Whom do we have to talk to? Nobody. And then, just as the whole political map of Israel is being, do you understand, redrawn in a political revolution, Hamas begins to send rockets over to Israel, just a few. So, strategy is very simple. Open the gates. Out comes the Israeli army into Gaza. All right, well, that fits our plan, right? The world sympathizes with us. And then, a few days later, up north, Hezbollah crosses the border, kills Israeli soldiers and captures Israeli soldiers and takes them back to Lebanon. And now Olmert says, we don't find this acceptable. Open the gates. Sally forth. Well, so Israel sallies forth. The head of the armed forces is an Air Force general. And before he does his deal with the stock market, on the same day, he decides that the way to do this thing, of course, is to bomb. In that way, we will spare Israeli casualties. And once the war begins, the rockets come over the wall. And the result is, after over a month of war, the Israelis have been unable to prevent the Hezbollah from sending their rockets. America is fed up with waiting. The image of the Israeli military is tarnished. And Ehud Olmert, who only a few days before had been what? Riding triumphant, is now answering his critics. It's not my fault. It's not my fault. It was a victory. Oh. So now I want you to take a break, and I want you to come back in 5 minutes, and I'm going to tell you what the consequences are in Israel. The question, so what are the consequences? I mean, in the middle of this revolution, political revolution, what? This war starts, and everybody's so optimistic that this thing is going to work, the revolution, and now the war came. Well, the consequence. Ehud Olmert, who was the hero of the election, the continuer of the tradition of Sherwin, is now encountering, I mean, enormous anger. Do you understand? The Israelis don't know where to direct their anger because the anger is the frustration. How could we be defeated? And even if they say they won in the eyes of the world, they lost because it isn't that the enemy invaded their country and took them. It wasn't that their army was destroyed. They lost one of their most valuable assets, which was the image of this what? Invincible military machine. You let them in, they can what? Just like that. So now Olmert, who was so popular, I mean, his popularity has just plummeted. Even his wife won't make dinner for him. And the defense minister, who is the new leader of a Labor Party, the Labor Party finally appointed somebody who didn't come from the old establishment. They appointed a Moroccan by the name of Amir Peretz. In fact, one of the old leaders of the Labor Party, who comes from the old establishment, was so affronted by this that he left Labor and joined Kadima. His name is Shimon Peres. So now Peretz, between Olmert and Peretz running this war, who ordered all that bombing? Why didn't you send the troops in right away to clean out the net? Do you understand? Look what you've done. You made a mess. All right. So now Likud is off in the corner saying, we told you so. Did we not tell you so? So now Likud, which everybody thought was finished, they said, close the office, sell the building, don't do anything, we're finished, over. Netanyahu was prepared to sell brushes door to door. Likud and Netanyahu are now what? Revived. And in fact, opinion polls indicate that close to a majority of the people are prepared to what? Support Likud, because we need a party that knows how to manage a war. The Kadima, the whole political revolution, it's collapsed. It's collapsed because it is inconceivable now with rockets that the Israelis will turn over the West Bank, or part of it, or most of it, to the Palestinians. How can they do that? Because that means the Palestinians will be able to be 12 miles from central Tel Aviv. I mean, the rockets reached Haifa, but they didn't get to Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. Now what? Impossible. The whole Sharon Olmert program was the abandonment, you understand, the withdrawal from not only Gaza, but also most of the West Bank, and therefore sort of saying to the world, we can't talk to these crazy people in Hamas, but we are prepared to what? Give up territory. We're good guys. All right. Now, how the Israeli public opinion is overwhelmingly now opposed to going through with the plan. And the Kadima party, which was created by Sharon, this new centrist party to be this vision, well, if the plan has collapsed and Sharon isn't around, who needs this party? So it's like, you know, you just went through this, you went through the revolution, and now the what? The center of the revolution is irrelevant. And now what people want, and we want them in America, are investigations. And the question is, Olmert says, I believe in an investigation. We should have this whole thing investigated, and I'm appointing the investigator. Ooh. We've had that right with our own government, right? And the people, no, we want a what? An outside investigator to find out why this whole thing was botched. Meanwhile, Netanyahu, who was learning his little brush speech, Netanyahu is back on the what political scene saying, I'm the leader of Likud, and I told you from the beginning it wouldn't work. We have been betrayed. You put me, do you understand? We have to have an election again. And you have to put me in power, and I assure you, if you put me in power, we will not surrender the West Bank. And if Hezbollah attacks, we will risk the casualties. We're going to go in and clean up the nests. Bibi's a good speaker. Now, this is key. America is very disappointed in the Israeli performance. I mean, they don't come out and say that. They are very disappointed. The one thing, it's true that Israel could provoke hostility, but the one thing you could count on is if you gave them a job, they would what? Just like that. Now they're not sure. That's a vulnerability, because Israel depends very much on what we call the goodwill of the United States of America and the respect which the Americans give the Israeli army. Hamas is a problem, but it's a minor problem. You know, Hamas said they won't talk with the Israelis. So meanwhile, all aid is cut off. The Israelis won't send them even the taxes they collect for them, for the Palestinians. And now the Europeans won't send them any aid because they won't recognize the right of the State of Israel to exist. So their economy is totally and absolutely collapsing. The last bit of news is Hamas has consented to include PLO people who do recognize the right of the State of Israel to exist in their government. It's a mess. The point is, given their present economic condition, the Palestinian Authority cannot do very much because, quite frankly, if they could get from Iran large numbers of rockets, and now they send them toward Ashkelon and Ashdod and Gaza itself would be, do you understand? It would be quickly reoccupied. But Hezbollah is a problem. The UN is now on the Lebanon frontier, right? But the UN has said, with its 5,000 soldiers, the Israelis wanted 15,000, with its 5,000 soldiers, or maybe a few more, we will not disarm Hezbollah. So you come back with your what? With your rockets. It's true now the UN is patrolling and it's more difficult, but if you're simply in this waiting posture, wanting to demoralize the enemy, And then Hezbollah is supported by a country that has now emerged as the major threat in the area, trying to make an atomic bomb and calling for the new president of Iran, calling for the destruction of the Jewish state and denying that the Holocaust was real. It's simply an excuse invented by Jews to justify their occupation of Israel. And Iran has now emboldened Syria. One of the reasons why Israelis were in favor of the Iraq War, they feared Saddam Hussein, so they wanted him overthrown. But quite frankly, if Iraq is occupied by the Americans, they stand between Iran and what's Syria. Syria is now surrounded by Americans in Iraq, Americans in Turkey, or the Turks, and Israelis to the south. Do you understand? It's like... But if Syria is emboldened by this defeat to fully ally itself with Iran, and if Iraq is in turmoil under the control of Shiites who sympathize with Iran and the Shiite government in Syria, and Israel has reduced power because its image has been tarnished. So now there are two scenarios. I'm going to give you the two scenarios and conclude. Do I know which one will take place? As I often say, if I did, would I be here? No, I'd be on a consulting jag anyway. Two scenarios. Scenario one. The people in the street demand a new election. Do you understand? Olmert had just been elected. He can wait for 5 years, do you understand, for another election. But now, do you understand the pressure, election. So what? There's a new election. And in the new election, the anger of the people puts Likud back in power and Bibi Netanyahu. The inconceivable, do you understand? A few months, what? Never, he was finished. For people who think they're through, it's a source of optimism, this story. Do you understand? Do you understand? He was at the bottom. The second scenario is that the people in Kadima and Labor, whatever, say, Olmert has to go, but no election. Because if we have the election, we may lose power. What we need to do is to change the leadership. So the second scenario is, they say, what do you mean we just had an election? Do you understand? A few months ago, we had an election. The Knesset was elected, and then they find an alternative to Olmert. Do they give him what we call a decent time to leave with self-respect, or do they kick him out? He most likely is finished. Do you understand? It's a matter of time. And so who? Amir Peretz will what? He'll go. I'm going to tell you, he's finished. He's finished as a defense minister, and he's finished as the head of the Labor Party. Who is there? Tzipi Livni, who is the foreign minister, she cooperated with the other two. I mean, who's there that anybody knows? So they're throwing out the names. So this is a coalition to keep Bibi from what? Taking over. We'll get rid of Ehud, but we won't have an election because we have the votes. we're not going to do that. So they surface, certain names now surface, you know. One of the people is an old Likudnik, a moderate by the name of Don Meridor, maybe him. Another one is a labor guy, related to Moshe Dayan, Uzi Dayan. I mean, they throw out these names. Most of these names are not generally known outside of Israel. I mean, their best deal, by the way, and it's a little grisly, would be to find somebody who can communicate with Sharon. No. It's a very iffy thing, that is. You have to get rid of Olmert. You don't want to have the election, but you don't want Netanyahu to come in. But there's nobody around that's going to be what we call a kind of credible, charismatic leader. And whichever scenario takes place, there is now looming the great threat. The great threat is the revival of Iran as a major issue in the survival of the state of Israel and the politics of the Middle East. And now, revived by Iran, is Syria, that was scared and is now allied with Iran, both supporting Hezbollah, both responsible for encouraging Hezbollah to make incidents. So before we can go any further, we have to talk about Syria and Iran, don't we? So I hope you'll come back next week when I do. Thank you all very, very much.
There is.
On to www.gusoconnor.com and get a location on us, and I'll make these oysters for you personally. So I saute the onions, I put Irish mist, and what I do is I take a little bit of cream, a little bit of heavy cream, and I make it a goat cream. I add some goat cheese to it, a nice amount of goat cheese, so that this cooks up and gets nice and flavorful. And the goat cheese, you know, it's got that kind of finish to it. And then you got the Irish mist that's nice and